Nova Scotia, een schiereiland aan de oostkust van Canada. En diep in de bossen aan het eind van een moeilijk begaanbare weg woont een 8-tal kluizenaars, mannen en vrouwen. Ze behoren tot de orde der Karmelieten. Aan het hoofd staat moeder Tessa Bielecki. Samen met William McNamara stichtte zij het Spiritual Life Institute of America, waarbij de nadruk ligt op leven in en met de natuur.
My father was a doctor, my mother was a nurse, but we like to laugh at my father and tease him because in a very real way he never was anything other than a Polish peasant, which made him very, very different from, very professional people. He was just always, and still alive, very simply himself, so that half the time he was more interested in picking mushrooms, for example, than being a very sophisticated doctor.
Well, did the fact that you come from a Polish family influence your spirituality?
Oh, definitely. I think the strongest dimension about being Polish was the rootedness in the earth and the rootedness in Catholicism, so that unlike other American Catholics that I knew, my life was much richer as a Catholic for being Polish. So we were rooted in a whole rhythm of the seasons and in the whole rhythm of the liturgical year.
Do you have negative childhood memories?
No, I don't have any negative childhood memories. Isn't that funny?
Yes, it is.
I have nothing negative to say. I remember when I was bad, I remember once very dramatically being spanked with a leather strap because my brother and I had started a fire in the basement of the house. And,
as a game?
Yeah, as a game. We were fascinated by fire, and so we were lighting big piles of newspaper on fire, and then we would put it out. And we were punished very severely for this, but we deserved it. This was a very dangerous thing to do.
You studied Russian and French in Washington, and you were destined for a career in international relations, and then you suddenly became a Carmelite nun.
I studied languages. Partially, I was just fascinated by language and what we learn about people. I always loved people, what we would learn about people through their languages. And but then I got more interested in international relations, and so was studying the languages in order to go into some kind of work, probably at the United Nations. I thought I would be a translator or a diplomat. And the interesting thing is, then when I became a Carmelite and a monk, and that really was, in a sense, inevitable as I look back on it. I mean, my spirituality was really the most important thing, and then it became everything to me. But now, interestingly, as a monk, I am immersed in a world of international relations, but from the spiritual point of view. So I think it's very funny that I should have come full circle, and what my childhood dream was is what I am now living, but as a monk.
You were only 22.
I was 22.
No feeling of having missed something?
Absolutely nothing. I have missed nothing. I have missed nothing. What have I missed? What could I possibly miss?
Well, what you mentioned, a husband, children.
Oh, I don't miss a husband and a children at all because I live in a mixed community of men and women. So the good thing is that I'm not stuck with any one man. I have lots of men to be close friends with. And this whole life is the mystical life is one of fecundity, is one of spiritual fecundity. So I have many spiritual children, though I may not have physical children, and I don't miss it at all. I find this life is just so full that I would find marriage, now for me, we're talking of the very specific mystery of a vocation. For me, a husband and physical children would be, I would miss a fullness and a richness that I now enjoy as a result of being celibate. I think people have the wrong idea about celibacy. They think it's a shutting down, they think it's a closing off. And I find celibacy a tremendous opening up and an opportunity for loving universally, which is quite wonderful.
Een leven in stilte, ver van de bewoonde wereld. Mediterend, studerend en werkend, vanuit de gelofte armoede, kuisheid en gehoorzaamheid. Slechts 2 keer in de week wordt de stilte verbroken voor een gezamenlijke maaltijd. Op vrijdagavond en zondagmorgen. Met elkaar en met de gasten, die er voor kortere of langere tijd op retraite zijn.
But how close are you then?
Oh, we're very close as friends. Most people want to know, well, how does it work? And what about physical demonstrations of affection? And have there been any mistakes? That's always on people's minds. And we express our affection to one another very simply in, we hug one another, but only saying hello and saying goodbye. And we have very strict rules for how it works.
How does it
We
work?
know, for example, that there's a difference between affection, there's a difference between sexual arousal, and so we're very careful about how we relate to one another. There are certain things that we don't do that would be acceptable for people who live out in the world and who are, I shouldn't say sexually active, although what that really means is genitally active. So we make a distinction between sexuality and genitality. Every human being is sexual, whether you're celibate or not. It's impossible not to be sexual because our sexuality is tied in with our life force. And if you have a very low life force, you'll have a very low mystical life. So that same stuff that people express sexually can be channeled in all kinds of ways. And we channel that into loving universally. We channel it into our mystical life and also into our apostolic life, into taking care of lots of other people who come to the monastery.
Is it possible for everybody? Do you have to have the vocation to do that?
Oh, I think celibacy is very definitely a vocation. A permanent life of celibacy is a vocation. I personally am convinced that every person needs extended periods of celibacy, whether they're married or not, because it's a very healthy thing to do. I think one of the saddest things in life is our sexual drivenness. People don't have enough freedom in the area of sexuality. They think that if they feel certain things, that then they have to act in a certain way, so there is no freedom. And I think that the discipline of celibacy helps people become free, so that if people were more disciplined for periods of their life, not only would they be freer psychologically, sexually, and richer in their mystical life, but their love life would also be better, because whatever we are disciplined about, whatever we sacrifice, whatever we show moderation in, tastes better. So that I think that part of the reason that there's so much sexual promiscuity, for example, is that people are so bored that they horizontally feel the need for newness because they don't understand enough about depth, because there's not enough moderation.
You recreated a kind of hermit life around here. Did you feel the need to do it? I mean, this is a reform of the Carmelite movement, you can say?
The first kind of monastic life and the first kind of Carmelite life was the Aeromedical life, which means the hermit life, or a life where solitude is extremely important. And there were eras in the church when the Aeromedical life was extremely important. For example, in the Middle Ages, first of all, the monk was an integral part of society, so that when the monk walked down the street, everyone recognized that the monk had a part to play in the social structure. The hermit had a part to play. Now, the monastic life, and certainly the Aeromedical life, is so marginalized, is so on the periphery of life, that society doesn't, not only does society not understand that the hermit or the monk has a part to play in society as a whole, but contemporary society doesn't even know what the monk or the hermit is. So I might walk down the street in my long habit, for example, and people will come up to me and say, "Oh, are you part of the Shakespearean festival?" Which is really what happened to us once when we were in giving a workshop. Or another time, we were going home to the rectory after preaching in the church, and we were actually stopped by a policeman. It was very late at night, and we were stopped by a policeman in Denver, Colorado. He was actually going one way, turned around and came back the other way, stopped us. I was with one of our priests at the time, and he just got out of the car and said, "Well, what have we here? Are we going to a party?" Because he just presumed that we were in a costume and that we were going to some kind of costume party. And so what we are trying to do is show the perennial validity of the Aeromedical life, which again is a way of showing all of humanity that solitude is a very important value for everyone. Some people are professional solitaries, but that solitude is the birthright of every man, woman, and child. Pascal said that Pascal, the 17th century Frenchman who was such a genius in both science and spirituality, said, "All our troubles in life come because we do not spend some time alone in our rooms every day." And this is very, very true. What I find in counseling people is that if they spent a little more time alone, quietly, not doing anything, not necessarily even thinking of anything, but then eventually reflecting on the meaning of their lives, that lots of things fall. I don't mean that problems are simplistically solved, but things fall into place and we gain a sense of perspective when there is that kind of emphasis on solitude.
Do you take vows?
We take vows of poverty, celibacy, and obedience, or as we like to translate them, no fuss, no lust, and no rust for obedience, which means no narrowness, that you have to have an open mind, which is really what obedience means, because the literal word, the literal derivation from the Latin means listening. And the one who is not listening is surd, or is absurd or deaf, which is an interesting understanding of the meaning of the word.
What's the hardest
absurd
vow?
The hardest vow for most people, surprisingly, is not celibacy, but obedience.
Is it?
Yes, because the hardest, the root problem for every human being is selfishness or self-love, and obedience is precisely geared towards undoing that self-love or self-will, and that is the most important thing. Celibacy might be initially difficult, but once you're over a certain transition, celibacy is not difficult because there are so many rewards to it. And poverty just makes good sense, and in this day and age, with the world in the condition that it's in, we don't even need religion to tell us that we should be living a simple life. Poverty doesn't mean destitution. It means really simplicity and sufficiency. And so this is just a moral obligation for everyone in the world today. But obedience is very, very difficult because everyone wants to do what everyone wants to do. On our own terms we want to do it. So to be listening to the will of others, to have to make decisions, all your decisions in terms of the common good, which is really what obedience is about, is very difficult for people.
Do you think that living here as a hermit can actually change something in society?
I believe very strongly that living as a hermit can change society in many different ways. First of all, on the most mysterious level, which is that level of faith, I know that my living here makes a difference in ways that I can't even fathom, that I couldn't even begin to understand. But I also see direct ways in which how I live here makes a difference in society. I mentioned that our way of life is very sane. I think contemporary society is crazy. Not all of it's crazy, but a lot of it is very crazy. There's an insanity to it. The addictions to power, to prestige, to pleasure, the amount of money that is spent on war, the amount of money that is spent on ridiculous things. When I'm so horrified when you walk into a department store and you see the proliferation of consumer goods that are making a few people rich and leaving the rest of the world poor. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. And there is a tremendous sanity to the way we live here, where we try to give more than we take, where we walk lightly on the earth, where our environmental impact, for example, is very small.
But can this change society outside?
It can
Does it
change
make a difference?
society outside in the sense that people see an alternative. They see a model. First of all, by trying to stay balanced and sane and reasonable and light on the earth ourselves, we are not doing damage. That's a way that has a direct impact. And then what's important is that people see us and they have to ask questions. And so they say, well, what about me? You know, what am I doing? What's the quality of my life? And also then if people come and see what we are trying to do is reach leaders so that, say, if the president of a corporation comes and he is changed. Aldous Huxley said, the contemplation is the only proven way of changing human behavior permanently. Now, what did he mean by that? He means that talk can't change us. It might change our mind for a while, but it just stays on a superficial level of the intellect. Programs can change us up to a point. Yes, and we need all of these things. I am not belittling any of these things, but they have a limited capacity for social change. Political policies are very important, but if you are only behaving a certain way because there is a law that makes you do that, the first chance you have to break that law, you will. Now, contemplation is a radical change of mind and heart. It changes us from the inside out so that we become so profoundly different that we cannot but act for the common good. So this life then becomes a very practical way of life that can have ramifications.
Dear Father Ramon, I know that you're critical of the institutional church, as I am myself, but isn't the institutional element an integral part of religion, as Baron von Hugel said? So how can we do without it? And what would a reformed or a transformed institutional church look like?
Ramon Panikar says that when we go into dialogue, we must be what he calls vulnerable to conversion. This is extremely important. Now, what he means by that is, I go to talk to a Buddhist, I must be vulnerable to conversion. That does not mean I'm going to convert and become a Buddhist, nor does it mean that the Buddhist is going to convert and become a Christian. It means that I am going to become a very different kind of Christian because I've talked to a Buddhist, and the same for the Buddhist who has talked to a Christian. And that has happened to me in ways that are not easy to describe because it's not terribly conceptual. What has happened to me is I have broken open, and there simply is an openness in me, an openness in my mind, an openness in my heart, and just an openness in my whole being that I even feel physically, so that I accept things, I listen to things that I would simply have been closed to before. Louis Dupre says that we must not merely tolerate other religions and let them live as opposed to killing them. This is the same thing that Panikar is saying. This is what my own experience is. It means that there has to be not mere toleration, but an affirmation of the other. In our community, a community is already ecumenical in the sense that it is a group of very unique individuals. So what we say in our own community is that we must celebrate alterity, meaning alter from the Latin, meaning we must celebrate otherness. We don't merely tolerate one another's otherness, but we should celebrate that. And well, the same thing is true if you look at the whole human family or the whole religious family on the planet, that there is otherness. And personally, I've been enriched by the otherness, that we are not all meant to be the same, and there's a spark. This goes back to what I was saying about polarities. There's a spark that comes from otherness. That's why a man-woman community is so exciting. There's a spark that comes because there's something different. Well, there's a spark that comes when a Christian and a Buddhist talk to one another.
You say that the feminine side of life is undervalued. Now, I've got the impression when women take up important jobs in society that they tend to get masculine.
Oh, I agree totally. Women want to have their voices heard today, but what ends up happening is that they end up sounding like men, or they behave like men. They become ruthless, they become tough, they become hard. They're just as exclusive in shutting out men as they think men were in shutting out women. And so I think it's extremely important. That's why we're living together as a man-woman community. That's why I like to write about man-woman themes. That's why I found St. Teresa so interesting, because Teresa was such a powerful woman, but she needed men in her life, and she did not try to live without them. And she would have been nothing without men. I have just recently discovered Hildegard of Bingen, and I know you're working with Hildegard, and I was fascinated that there was a tremendous dynamic between Hildegard and the men in her life, that her secretaries were men, for example, and that she was quite lost until she could dialogue with St. Bernard of Clairvaux and draw on his masculine strength and his masculine wisdom, which then empowered her to become who she was as a woman. So we need one another to become who we're meant to be. A man helps a woman become a woman, and a woman helps a man become a man in very mysterious ways. If you asked me, I wouldn't know how to describe that exactly. But we become more of who we are in relationship. Everything is relationship, not a shutting off of one for the sake of the other. And I have no patience at all with masculine women, with angry women, with man-hating women.
I wonder what you think about the role of women in present-day church.
I know that there are so many women who are miserably unhappy about the so-called role of women in the church, and I find a lot of that very silly, because I think women have always had a strong role in the church as women. Now, if women become obsessed with the necessity of becoming priests in order to have a role in the church, then they're going to be very unhappy. And I have a different understanding of this than most liberated women. I don't consider myself a feminist or what we could call a woman's liber, but I consider myself a liberated woman. And I have no desire at all to become a priest. And I think that the women who obsess on this are sort of caught up in the reversal of the paternalistic thing, because they think that to be a priest is the ultimate it's the ultimate role in the church. It is not the ultimate role in the church. I think the role of spiritual guide is more important, for example, and that has always been accessible to women.
And it's not an official thing.
It is not an official role. It doesn't matter that it's not an official role. What difference does that make? It has, for example, in my own community, I'm thinking of one particular feminist who's always arguing, well, how come you can't be there at the altar? All these men in your community are at the altar. And I just want to laugh and say, I'm the abbess of the community. These men do what I tell them to do. What difference does it make that I can't celebrate the Mass? That has nothing to do with it.
The stars, more mighty than the sea, are you, Most High. The Lord is King, His splendor He is robed. The Lord is robed in majesty. My song is lifted to the King, forever will my heart be filled with Him. The Lord is King, in splendor He is robed. The Lord is robed in majesty.
The time that my mother died, she was suffering so terribly, I even thought I was losing my faith because I couldn't pray. And it turned out to be actually a tremendously great experience of growing in faith and a deepening of my faith, because I ended up not praying in the same old way, but I was praying in a much deeper way that had no words, that had no thoughts, that was just an agonized cry of the heart, which must have been very much like Christ really crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was that kind of experience, feeling so forsaken that I couldn't even say those words, where I was just choked, almost choked to death. Nothing would come. All I could do was look at my crucifix or hold on to a crucifix, which was such a symbol of not having lost the faith that I was clinging. I remember in a discussion once with the Dalai Lama when an ex-Christian was trying to get the Dalai Lama to say that we Christians wallow in suffering and the Buddhists know a way out of suffering that the Buddha taught. The Dalai Lama, because he is truly a holy man, and when you touch that deeply, the not the sameness, but the similarities between the traditions are so strong. The Dalai Lama said the only way out of pain is through it, which is a perfect description of the central mystery of Christianity, the Paschal mystery, which is going through crucifixion in order to be resurrected. The end is not crucifixion. The end is resurrection. But there is no resurrection without crucifixion. There is no glory without passing through suffering.
What do you think is the most urgent problem in present-day society?
I think the most urgent problem in present-day society is the loss of the sacred, or the loss of the mystical, that we have reduced life to the merely secular or the merely materialistic, and we have lost the sense that there is a whole other dimension, and so we're being starved to death because all we do is involve ourselves in the material.
What role do you see for religion or the church in the 21st century?
There are so many people who talk about the elimination of institutionalized religion, the elimination of structures, the elimination of the church. I don't see that at all. I think that the church has a role that's very similar to what I've been trying to describe as the role of the monk and the role of the hermit, and that is to remind us that we are spiritual beings, that we are called to enjoy the mystical life. And without the church, I think that dimension is absolutely lost. And one of the problems with the church is the fact that it has become so secularized, and since the Vatican Council, we're doing the very things that secular society can do even better than the church can do, and we are no longer immersed in our destiny of feeding the people with the mystical life, and that is the role of the church in the future. The church of the future must be a mystical church, or it will die out.
Thank you, Mother Tessa, for creating this newness.
Thank you very much, Lucette.